I'm very pleased to welcome our speakers tonight, Chris and Wendy Tackett. But thank you guys so much for coming back again. Let's give them a very warm welcome.
Here's some forms.
Good. Okay, is this one working? Well, this is a really nice crowd, and we appreciate all of you coming to listen to us and lend an ear to what we have to say and potentially learn a little bit from our experience about Christian nationalism. So I'm Wendy, and this is Chris Tackett. And I kind of start out by telling you about our experience, and we'll kind of get through what we have to say, and then we'll do the Q&A at the end. So Chris and I grew up in Granbury, Texas. It's just southwest of Fort Worth. We both went to school there, and we graduated high school there. We moved away and, went to college and became young adults and started our family. And in 2008, we had been out of state for a while, and we decided we were moving back to Texas, and we went back to Granbury because we had grown up there and graduated there, so we thought we'll raise our kids there. And we were both very involved in the community. I volunteered with the school district when our kids were young, and Chris ran the local baseball and softball league for a good long while. And then in 2014, he said, or just before 2014, he said, I'm going to run for school board. And I said, I think that's a fantastic idea. And so he did. And he did win his race, so I'll just go ahead and put that out there. He won and was able to serve, but while he was campaigning, and again, it was our hometown, there were a lot of people we knew, but Granbury is an area that's growing, and so there, of course, were some people that did not know Chris. And so, like you do, it's a nonpartisan race, school board is, or it's supposed to be. And so he was going to lots of different groups and clubs to introduce himself, get to know people he might not know. And he came home one night after being at a Republican club meeting, and he said, this was really a strange occurrence. The speaker that they had tonight the whole speech was about the importance of taking over school boards, conservatives taking over school boards. And this was in 2014. And that was really foreign to us, right? Because, again, we grew up in Granbury. We knew the folks there. We knew that there had always been people from both parties serving on the school board. It had always been a very nonpartisan / bipartisan, if you want to call it that, arrangement. And it worked out well for the whole community. So this was a really strange thing.
And let me add just one element there.
All right.
So he wasn't just saying conservatives should take over school boards. He was saying that conservatives should take over school boards because of woke indoctrination. We've all heard those terms tossed around, right? But his whole point was we want to be able to control what these kids are learning, and the best place to start doing that is in local schools. So that's why we have to control school boards, which, again, freaked me out.
So at any rate, Chris won his race, and he was serving on the school board. And after that first instance, we started seeing some other things happen in Granbury that just weren't normal to us. In 2015, there was a local mom who filed a complaint with our county library, not the school library, but the county library, for having 2 LGBTQ books in the kids section, right? So that became a whole thing, and we had the National Library Association, helping, and we had a rock star librarian there at the time, and she fought the good fight, and those books stayed in our library. But that was a strange thing. We hadn't seen that happen before. We had voter engagement events happening in town. They were Christian Nationalist voter engagement events. David Barton, that runs Wall Builders out of Aledo, and Raphael Cruz, Ted's dad, they were kind of heading these up and running these in town. Dave Welch, who is the head of the National Pastor Council, had come to town to talk to the Chamber of Commerce. And this was during the first the first iteration of the bathroom bill, and he was trying to get the Chamber of Commerce to get behind the anti-transgender bathroom bill legislation that the Texas House was working on. So there were just many things like that that we were seeing happening in our town that we thought, man, this is not like anything we've seen happen. Now, Granbury was always a conservative town. I'm not going to, try to say it wasn't conservative, but we had just not ever seen this mixing of, religion and politics just so blatant. And the other thing I want to say too is going back to the library book situation. So what was so strange about it was that a lot of the people that were showing up at county commissioners meetings to speak in favor of banning the books were a lot of the pastors from town, right? And we just hadn't seen that kind of political involvement before, and it felt strange. And so as Chris was serving, he was also noticing that some weird things were happening with our new state representative, and I'll let him take over from there.
Yeah, so we had a newly elected state representative in House District 60, which basically runs from Granbury and Hood County points west, right? Catches Brownwood and Breckenridge and places like that. And he was from Granbury. Right? So it's like, hey, this is the local school district. It's the biggest one, it's biggest district, biggest community in House District 60. As a school board, we met with him and he talked about being pro-public education. And we're like, great, because we need a lot of help. And so as the session got started and bills started to be filed, the superintendent, with the blessing of the school board, we put together the list of the bills that were pro-public education and the things that were trying to do things like bring vouchers into our communities and into our school system, and a whole lot of other things that were anti-public ed. And at the time, he responded, yep, got it, I got your back, blah, blah, blah. Well, when it came time to vote, which is when the rubber really meets the road, he voted against everything we asked him to vote for, and voted for all the things that we asked him to vote against. All the way down the line. The only thing that you could say was pro-public ed he voted for was the final budget, which gave some money to public education. That was literally it. So, as somebody who's data-minded, right? I mean, I'm an analytical guy. I started trying to ask why. Why would someone go through and tell us they're pro-public education when we give them the things that are truly pro-public education and say, please support? They choose not to. Why would they do that when they're telling us they will? So I went to the Texas Ethics Commission website because the only thing I could come up with is it has to be money, right? There has to be money involved here that's controlling this. And when I pulled all of the records from the Texas Ethics Commission for Mike Lang, who was the representative, I was floored when I'm looking at the numbers because there were some big numbers. Contributions over hundreds of thousands of dollars going into his account. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is awful. And I showed it to Mindy. And she's looking at my spreadsheet.
I am not a data person.
She's looking at my spreadsheet and goes, dude, this is just a bunch of numbers and lines on a page. Spreadsheets, no. So I was like, okay, well then obviously this isn't effective. What else can I do? So I turned it into a pie chart to where you could now see how big of a slice these people had of this representative. And once you started looking at it, there were a handful of really big slices that were related to a gentleman named Ferris Wilks, who is a fracking billionaire from Cisco, Texas. At the time, I had no clue who this guy was. I've learned a lot since. There was a group, political action committee called Empower Texans. That was a huge piece, not as big as Ferris Wilks, but they were the next biggest. And then there was a gentleman named Tim Dunn. And those were three big slices on this piece of pie. And now when I showed Mindy the pie chart, it was like, whoa, this is a problem, right? Because what we realized, and it was about 65, 70% of this guy's pie chart was 3 donors. So now you know, if you're not one of those 3 donors, it doesn't matter what you say, because that's who's making sure he gets elected. That was a light bulb moment for me. So I did the thing that people do, is I took screenshots and I posted them on Facebook and Twitter and things like that to share with my community. And people were like, yeah, that's not good. But the other thing is, people who weren't in our community started seeing my pie charts. And they were like, hey, can you make one for my rep? Because we're running into exactly the same thing. When I started to do that, I started to see the same names showing up on the pie charts. And I started pulling every record and started figuring out there was a ridiculous web of money that was pouring into state-level races, attempting to buy legislators. And it may have been legislators that were totally down with what they wanted, but were willing to, go along with it, right? And you started to see not only Ferris Wilks and Tim Dunn, but that group Empower Texans, when I started trying to look at who that political action committee was, you start seeing the donors to that are Ferris Wilks and Tim Dunn. And then you start looking at other political action committees. Texas Right to Life was almost like 85-90% funded by Ferris Wilks. Texans for Fiscal Responsibility was almost exclusively funded by Tim Dunn. The Texas Homeschool Coalition was almost exclusively funded by Ferris Wilks. So all of a sudden you realize, and we just went through primary season, right? I'm sure many of your mailboxes were like collapsing under the weight of your daily mailers that were showing up. Well, for low information voters, when they see all of these mailers coming in from all of these different groups that have names that sound reasonable, and they're supporting the same candidate. It's not the candidate sending you mailers saying support me because this is what I believe. It's 15 other groups sending these mailers out, all telling you to vote for the same person. That low information voter may take that and go, well, that's who I should be supporting, right? And that's what we have seen happening across the state. It was happening when I started looking in 2017, and it continues all the way through. And I started talking about it a lot. A lot of other people started also talking about it. And there were journalists who had written stories about it that Mindy and I looked at and was like, yes, this validates what we're thinking, right? Somebody else has seen it. But we kept making noise, and a whole lot of other people started paying attention too. And that 2018 election, after a bunch of us had made noise and really kind of turned Empower Texans and that whole network of donors, it turned into a bad word. There were candidates all over the state that people would ask them, hey, are you getting any money from Empower Texans? And they go, no, I'm not taking their money. And then you start looking at it, and okay, they're not taking from the PAC directly, but they're taking from all the rest of them that are funded by all the same people. So, and it wasn't just playing only at state house levels. I mean, it was also playing at the Texas Senate. It was also starting to then play down into local races, right? And I'll say, the local campaign finance reports, those don't get filed in Austin, which is where I was pulling everything from. Those are all filed locally in local jurisdictions. They're not even all in one spot locally. If you want school board campaign finance reports, you have to go to the school board admin office, or if it's a big enough district, you can get them online, but they're not in an electronic format that you can easily digest into a spreadsheet. It's a PDF scan of all these pages. So it's really hard to compile. If you want city council stuff, you've got to go to the city offices to get stuff. You want county things, you've got to go to the county offices. It is all designed to make it hard to understand where the money's really going. So we had waded through a lot of things. And by 2018, again, Empower Texans was a bad word. And they kind of got their clocks cleaned broadly in the actual elections. Right? When it came time for people to vote, their candidates lost a ton. Didn't win many races, and they spent a ton of money doing it. And there were a whole lot of people around the state that thought they're done. Right? These folks are gone, we've beaten them back. And we were a little skeptical. Because as we were figuring out what was happening, what had happened, all the way up through my school board race, what continued to change in our community, what was happening with these races, and the whole idea of the Overton window pulling every single politician more and more to the right, even the ones who may have felt pretty normal before, started supporting things that wouldn't have been necessarily on the radar before. They became normalized. We started trying to dig into not only what was happening, because I think I had done a pretty good job and others had done a good job understanding what was happening, the web of the money, what they were doing. The bigger question that we had to start coming to grips with was why? And that's where Mindy really dug in.
Yeah, Chris is data and I'm kind of a sociology person. Anyway, so we did start digging into the why, because I was like, I don't understand why these people are coming to our town in Granbury, Texas. What do they care about what's happening here in Granbury, Texas? Why are they doing this? And so we did start digging in and we started reading, and I came across some articles that kind of gave the outline of and the language for what is Christian nationalism. And that was my light bulb moment. I mean, we both had an additional light bulb moment, but that was a light bulb moment for me to think, this is it. This is the language that I need to describe what we're seeing happening here. So I'm going to tell you kind of the definition of Christian nationalism, a working definition, and then we'll discuss some more things that had gone on in our community. I tend to use a definition, and I'm pretty much paraphrasing here, but Amanda Tyler with Christians Against Christian Nationalism has a great working definition. And Christian nationalism is a political ideology and a cultural framework that seeks to merge American and Christian identities. So the idea of that Christian nationalism tries to get across is that to be a true American, you have to be Christian. And that to be a real Christian, you have to be an American that adheres to certain political ideology, right? That you have to have certain viewpoints, political viewpoints, right? To be a good, real Christian. Now, I want to say right here that Christian nationalism is not the same as Christianity. Christian nationalism is a merging of political and using religious ideology or viewpoints to back it up, right? So the thought is Christianity should have preference in the United States above all other faith traditions or people who don't have a faith tradition, that they should get preference, or that Christianity should get preference, and that we were founded as a Christian nation, and that that's what our founders intended, and that our laws ought to be biblically informed or biblically based, right? So that's kind of in a nutshell what Christian nationalism means. So, and as we first started talking about this, we came across a lot of people, especially in our community, that would get real bristly when you said the phrase Christian nationalism, because people take it personally and think, well, you're talking about me and my faith. And not all Christians are Christian nationalists, but some Christians can adhere to Christian nationalist ideology, but Christianity is not the same as Christian nationalism. They do not equal one another. So going on to some of the other things that happened from like 2016 on. At the 2016 presidential election, one of the largest churches, arguably the largest church, it's a multi-campus church in Hood County, had organized an event called One Nation Under God for the election. And they partnered with multiple other churches, throughout the county
I think they had like 25 different churches all participating
to do these
in the sermon series.
Yeah, these sermons leading into the 2016 election. And so I was interested, right, after everything else we had seen, and I was watching some of these sermons. And this particular church was flat out preaching. They had a whiteboard like that, and they, on their big screen monitors were preaching Seven Mountains Dominionism. And my heart sank because we had friends that went to that church. We knew so many people who attended that church. And by this time we were starting to get, a little bit of idea about this is strange, this is different, and I knew Seven Mountains Dominionism was not what I had ever seen in a church before. We also had Raphael Cruz coming back to town.
Go
ahead.
Before you dive further, Seven Mountains Dominionism, when Mindy said that, I heard a few folks go, "Oh," right? We should define that for you before we go any further,
go ahead. You can do it now.
So, Seven Mountains Dominionism is this idea that there are 7 mountains or 7 pillars of society that control culture and control nations, right? And that it's an end times philosophy that Christ will not return until Christians are sitting at the top or the peak of all 7 of those mountains and controlling culture in whole nations, okay? And the 7 mountains in that idea, it's the church, it's the family, which is very much about one man, one woman. It's where a lot of the anti-LGBTQ elements comes from. It's education, which is takeover of schools, right? If you can't tear them down, do other things, right? Inject it in. It's government, because they know to be able to control levers of power, you have to be able to pass laws and impose. It's arts and entertainment. They're working on it. It's media. It's creating your own media ecosystems. And it's business, because they know they need money to make it all go. So those are the 7 mountains. And to hear it preached in the regular Sunday services of what is the largest church in the community, and knowing elements of it are going out to another 25 different churches that weren't all using exactly the same message, but were all part of this sermon series, again, it was so concerning to us. And as we continue to talk about Christian nationalism, and we'll touch on a whole lot of other things, understand that there's the ideology of Christian nationalism that is rampant, right? The thing that is driving Christian nationalism forward is Seven Mountains Dominionism. So keep that in mind. There's bad, and then there's really bad.
Yeah. Well, and so to kind of finish up this little segment, the other thing that we saw continuing to happen were people coming to town. And Raphael Cruz was one of them, that he was there on the regular. And he would be talking to different groups and different church groups. And he was flat out saying, there is no separation of church and state, that's a myth. He was telling people that schools were indoctrinating children. Have we heard that before? And was preaching also 7 mountains ideology to these different orgs and church groups. And so we just kept looking at it going, oh my, and we did a lot of reading, we did a lot of digging, we connected with experts throughout the U.S. who have taught us so much. There's nothing that we know that we figured out on our own. It was all these other people that have, done the work for decades, really, to lay out the framework and the understanding of what this is. But that's how we came to understand what Christian nationalism is, and the reason that we started beating the drum in our local community and as far out as we could beyond that, because we knew that it wasn't just our community. Other people were telling us, yeah, we're seeing those same things happen here, right? And as we've gone forward, we've seen legislation, bills filed and passed in Austin that are Christian nationalist inspired bills, right? So we look at all the bathroom bills and anti-trans bills that have happened the last few sessions. We look at SB 8, which was the anti-abortion, removing people's reproductive rights, that was session before last. The book bans, HB 900, that passed this last session. The chaplain bill, where they voted to allow chaplains to replace school counselors in public schools. The Ten Commandments bill, where, they filed the Ten Commandments bill, they didn't pass that one, but the In God We Trust. They've done a couple of different, they passed one session before last, and they passed another iteration of that this last session. So there has just been a plethora of bills that we've seen filed and legislation that's been passed. And we all also in this room probably know that vouchers, right? The voucher fight, they are coming after public schools. And so the voucher fight has been going on for a while, but it's 100% Christian nationalist in nature.
And the thing is, it wasn't just, of course, a Granbury thing, right? Those voter engagement events that Mindy was talking about, they were happening all over the Metroplex, all over the state. People from out of state coming in and beating the drum loudly in those spaces, whether it's Charlie Kirk, whether it's Ben Shapiro, whether it's, some of those from those media ecosystems that have been created to amplify and pull these things forward.
And I did go to some of these church-oriented voter engagement events, and I sat through them and I recorded them, and was trying to gather as much documentation so people could see what's happening and what these folks are talking about and the language that they're using to convince people that Christian nationalism, which at the time they're not calling it Christian nationalism, but the buzzwords and the language that they're using to convince people this is the right way to go, and this defines us as Americans.
And the idea of Christian nationalism is to impose one version of faith on every single person in this country. Right? You may be of a different faith than but as long as you're subservient to this idea. And again, Mindy said Christians are privileged in all aspects of society. And the thing is, it's not really all Christians. It's the right kind of Christian, right? And when you think about the founding of this country, it is not to say that many of our founders weren't deeply religious. But they had seen what had happened in the 13 colonies, which were all founded with religious charters, right? Where they all had their own state religions. And there was a definite lack of religious freedom across all 13 of the colonies. So as we declared our freedom, right, from England, and as they were trying to establish a new government for us, the Constitution doesn't mention God at all going through it. There's actually a religious test that is outlawed. There can be no religious test for office. right? The idea of a separation of church and state. These were deeply religious people, and deists and non-religious folks as well, right? From all these different places who said, we want to make sure that people can truly have freedom of religion. Which means I can choose not to do something because it's against my religion, but it doesn't give you the right to impose your beliefs on me. Right?
Through government.
Through government. Mm-hmm. So that is the whole, this myth of, the founders always intended us to be a Christian nation. You go back and you look at the original writings and what they were doing and what they were talking about, it's just utterly false, right? And there's nothing to say that being a deeply religious person and using your faith to influence decisions you make when you're serving in office is one thing, but it's not to take people's rights away. It's not to impose that religion on everyone else, right? That is the core tenet of what the founders tried to put or not put into our Constitution. So let's come back to Wilkes and Dunn, because I can't help but talk about money and what's going on. So remember I said in 2018, everybody thought they were gone, right? That these guys had spent tons of money and it failed. So they'd walk away, because that's what rational people do, right? I made a big investment, it didn't work, I'm out. Well, as we started to figure out why they were doing these things, and again, Texas Monthly did a fabulous profile on Tim Dunn that really called a lot of things out. And they did another one recently, which was a lot of fun. I got to play in that one a little bit. But once we understood that it wasn't just about money and power, there was also religion playing into it. It was, these guys are going to retool and they're going to do something else. And what they did is they folded Empower Texans, right? They went away. And all of a sudden a new political action committee showed up called Defending Texas Liberty. And when you started looking at the numbers behind that one, it was Tim Dunn and Ferris Wilkes again, being run by Jonathan Stickland, who was the Texas Monthly named the cockroach in their annual reviews a couple of times. He was the one running it. And Defend Texas Liberty started doing exactly the same things that Empower Texans had done, right? It was just rebranded and hoping people weren't paying attention. Now, they started meeting with anti-Semites. The Texas Tribune did saw some of those guys who are leading some of the most hate-filled groups in the country showing up at the Defend Texas Liberty offices, and they had pictures of them going in and meeting with them. And they wrote stories about it. And it became a big deal, and Defend Texas Liberty became a bad word, just like Empower Texans had. And as we moved into this primary session, for what we were doing now, in January, a new PAC got started called Texas United for a Conservative Majority. It's Tuckum. Tuckum is how you would shorten that, right? TUCM. Exactly the same thing, right? Investing literally millions of dollars. And one of the things, because again, I'm a ridiculous geek, I rip the entire database from the Texas Ethics Commission that goes all the way back to 2000. So I have every single campaign finance report all the way back to 2000. And I try and graph these things, right? So I can understand where we've been and what's going on. And when you look at what was spent by Tim Dunn and Ferris Wilkes in like 6 years of Empower Texans, almost 7, they spent that much on just Defending Texas Liberty in 2. And what they're spending now, if they continue on their path, they'll dwarf that very shortly. So that is the reality of the money and the ideology that's coming. But it is more than just Wilkes and Dunn. Because this is an ideology being pushed from a lot of places. If they decided to fold up tent tomorrow, there will be others who will take up the mantle and carry it forward. Because what Wilkes and Dunn did is a cannonball into the deep end of the pool, right? And they made a lot of waves with Empower Texans, with their model of investing a lot of money in places that hadn't seen investment before. And it created ripples, right? They made a big splash, but the ripples, I talked about the Overton window and pulling everything into this Christian nationalist space. If you were going to run in the Republican primaries and you didn't believe what they believed, they were going to spend millions of dollars against you. And, just the woke indoctrination going on generally. All of that is to make people afraid of their local public school. Because as soon as you're no longer sold on your local public school, now you'll consider a voucher. If we don't fund it, we lose programs, we lose teachers, we lose campuses. Parents are now looking around going, maybe this school isn't the place for my kid. Where it has been, unquestionably before. I mean, one of the easiest places to see Christian nationalism playing out is the war on public education. It's the thing that we all see on the regular. And it doesn't stop at public ed, right? It's as you control this, it's moving to the next thing.
Well, Chris likes to, I probably should be letting you say this part, but Chris likes to kind of define it Christian, and we really need to be saying white Christian nationalism, because it is white Christian nationalism. It is based in racism, amongst other things, but it is based in racism. And it's kind of the root that all of these different issues grow out from, right? So as we see the anti-LGBTQ stuff, we see the attacks on reproductive rights, we see the attacks on immigrants, we see the attacks on library books, we see the pro-voucher push. All of these different issues are all anchored by or rooted in Christian nationalism. So Chris likes to say Christian nationalism is the root of the rot. Because until we can chase down all these issues individually till we are totally out of energy, which is really what they're hoping for. But what we have to recognize in our communities is that it's not just these individual issues. It's white Christian nationalism. And that's what we have to defeat, because it is the biggest threat to American democracy. When you look at January 6th, Christian nationalism. It is the biggest threat to democracy, and until we stop Christian nationalism and this movement from taking hold in this country, democracy is in deep jeopardy. And that's true. And this, there's just no getting around that.
And as we think about November, right? What is coming? There is an entire set of groups, the Heritage Foundation, Focus on the Family, literally a laundry list of extreme organizations have partnered together to write something called Project 2025, right? And their intent is to basically tear down as much of the federal government as possible and replace it. There's bullet points in it that speak to implementing Christian nationalism across the country. But it only happens if one party wins, right. One candidate wins. So understanding, and I won't delve too far into Project 2025, but go Google it, and it will freak you out for what the plan is.
Google it, though, to educate yourself. Right. We don't want you to leave feeling like, oh my gosh. We want you to be feeling empowered and educated. So do Google it and do read about it and do your best to understand what it is, because it is really, really important. And the thing about Texas is, especially this area of Texas, north central Texas, but Texas in general, we are absolutely an epicenter of the nation for Christian nationalism, because most of the main leadership folks live right here. So it's coming from here, right? Colorado Springs, you've got some areas of California, but Texas, we're where it comes from. Now, I know we've got to get to questions, so I just want to say this before we kind of move on to that section, and then if you have anything else you need to say, but I do want to leave you all with like some good news. When we first started talking about this, we were completely, you would have thought we had 3 heads and were painted purple. And we kind of became social pariahs in our town for talking about it, right? Nobody knew what it was. Everybody was offended. You know, people would bristle and not want to have any kind of conversation. And look where we are now, right? People are talking about it. The media is finally talking about it. You can turn on the news now and hear people discussing Christian nationalism. That is a huge step forward. Now, we have a lot of work to do, right? But it's groups like yours and each of you going out into your circle of influence and having these same kind of conversations, right? That's how we defeat it. And everybody has to go vote. You can't just be registered to vote. Everybody has to show up and vote, right? So those are things that, as we kind of close up, we leave you with to say, it is getting better from where we started back in 2014. And the more people that are educated about it and the more people that decide religious freedom is really important to us as Americans and as an American value, the better chance we have of holding on to democracy, because I think probably you're all here because you appreciate a democratic republic. I know people like to say.
Or constitutional republic, yeah.
So anyway.
Mindy and I are regular people, right? We're just like you. We ran into things in our hometown. It scared us. And we felt like we had to use whatever small, tiny platform we had to talk about it, using the tools we had, trying to leverage our networks. That's absolutely something you should do.
Chris has put together, I remember I'm not the computer data person, but Chris has put together a website. It's all free. It's called seeitnameitfightit.com. And we have gathered the different books and articles and resources there that you can, it'll tell you which book should I be reading about this? How did they know? And we have everything gathered there for you to be able to access.